In the frozen hellscape of Silver Creek, Montana, 1885, a desperate father's drunken gamble would spark the most unlikely romance the frontier had ever witnessed. When Luther May dragged his daughter Khloe to the town square like livestock, the jeering crowd had no idea they were about to witness something that would shake their very souls. The Mountain Man, Kent McKenna's thunderous declaration, "Stop, I'll buy that girl," would ignite a chain of events involving railroad barons, corrupt judges, and a love story that would prove even the most broken hearts can find redemption in the wilderness. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment below with your city, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The wind howled through Silver Creek like the dying breath of winter itself, carrying with it the stench of desperation and the bitter taste of broken dreams. Snow fell in thick, merciless sheets, blanketing the ramshackle frontier town in a shroud of white that seemed to muffle even hope itself. It was February 14th, 1885, Valentine's Day, though love was the furthest thing from anyone's mind in this godforsaken corner of Montana territory. The wooden buildings creaked and groaned under the weight of ice and sorrow, their weathered facades bearing witness to countless tragedies that had unfolded in their shadows. Saloon doors swung open intermittently, releasing bursts of yellow lamplight and raucous laughter that died quickly in the frigid air. This was a town where dreams came to die, where hope froze solid before it could take root. But on this particular morning, Silver Creek was about to witness something that would etch itself into the collective memory of every soul present, a moment so shocking, so utterly unexpected, that it would be whispered about in hushed tones for generations to come. Luther May stumbled through the snow-covered main street, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the Arctic air. His clothes were stained with whiskey and shame, his eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night spent drowning his sorrows at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Behind him, struggling to keep pace in the deep snow, walked his daughter Khloe. At 22 years old, Khloe May carried herself with a dignity that seemed almost supernatural given her circumstances. Her brown hair was pulled back severely, and her simple gray dress, the only decent one she owned, had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric. She was a large woman, soft and round-mouthed, in a world that prized hardness and angles, and the cruel residents of Silver Creek had never let her forget it. "Pick up the pace, girl," Luther snarled over his shoulder, his words slurring together. "We ain't got all day, and them railroad men don't like to be kept waiting." Khloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew where they were headed, had known, since she'd awakened to find her father counting silver coins with trembling, desperate fingers. The town square, the auction block, the place where livestock and property changed hands, where human dignity went to die. "Pa, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "There has to be another way. We could sell Ma's china or her wedding ring, or—" "Shut your mouth." Luther whirled around, his face twisted with rage and self-loathing. "You think I want this? You think I want to parade my own flesh and blood like some prize heifer?" His voice cracked, and for a moment the mask of cruelty slipped, revealing the broken man beneath. "But I owe them railroad boys $500, and they ain't the forgiving type. You understand, they'll burn down the house with us in it if I don't pay." The house. The little cabin on the outskirts of town that had been in their family for 3 generations. The place where Khloe's mother Sarah had drawn her last breath just 6 months ago, whispering prayers and promises that everything would be all right. The place where Khloe had knelt beside her mother's deathbed and sworn on the family Bible that she would take care of her father no matter what, even if it meant sacrificing herself. They reached the town square just as the church bell chimed 9 o'clock. Already a crowd had gathered, ranchers, shopkeepers, drifters, and railroad men, all drawn by the promise of spectacle and the opportunity to witness someone else's humiliation. Their faces were hard and hungry, their eyes glittering with a cruelty that seemed to feed on suffering. At the center of the square stood the auction block, a crude wooden platform that had seen the sale of everything from cattle to mining claims. Today, it would host something far more precious and infinitely more heartbreaking. "Well, well, well," came a smooth, cultured voice from the crowd. "If it isn't Luther May, punctual as always when it comes to settling his debts." The crowd parted to reveal Harrison Blackwood, representative of the Continental Railroad Company. He was a man who wore his cruelty like a fine suit, expensive, well-tailored, and impossible to miss. His black hair was slicked back with pomade. His mustache waxed to perfection, and his cold gray eyes held all the warmth of a winter grave. Behind Blackwood stood his enforcers, three large men whose faces bore the scars of countless fights and whose hands rested casually on the butts of their revolvers. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to collect one way or another. "Mr. Blackwood," Luther mumbled, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. I brought what we discussed." Blackwood's gaze shifted to Khloe, and his thin lips curled into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the complete absence of humanity behind it. "Ah, yes, the May girl. I must say, Luther, when you proposed this arrangement, I had my doubts. But desperate times call for desperate measures, don't they?" Khloe felt the weight of dozens of stares pressing down on her like physical forces. She could hear the whispers starting cruel and cutting. Look at the size of her. Who'd want to bid on that? Poor thing don't even know what's coming. Shameful treating your own daughter like cattle. But beneath the whispers, Khloe detected something else: pity. And somehow that was worse than the cruelty. At least cruelty acknowledged her as a person worth hating. Pity saw her as nothing more than a victim, powerless and pathetic. "Now then," Blackwood announced, producing a leather-bound ledger from his coat. "Let's get this unpleasant business concluded. The debt stands at $500 plus interest accrued over the past 3 months, bringing the total to $625. He snapped his fingers, and one of his men produced a small wooden crate, setting it down beside the auction block. "As agreed, Miss May will be sold to settle the debt. All proceeds will go directly to the Continental Railroad Company to satisfy Luther May's outstanding obligations." The auctioneer, a grizzled old man named Pete Holloway, climbed onto the platform with obvious reluctance. Pete had conducted hundreds of auctions in his time, but never anything like this. His weathered face was grim as he gestured for Khloe to join him on the block. "Come on then, miss," Pete said quietly, his voice gentler than she'd expected. "Let's get this over with." Khloe's legs felt like lead as she climbed the 3 wooden steps to the platform. The height advantage gave her a clear view of the crowd, and what she saw nearly broke her resolve. Faces twisted with anticipation, cruelty, and worst of all, amusement. To them, this wasn't a tragedy, it was entertainment. Her father stood at the edge of the crowd, unable to meet her eyes, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or simply the effects of alcohol withdrawal. Either way, he offered no comfort, no last-minute rescue, no paternal protection. He had made his choice, and she was the price. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pete called out, his voice carrying across the square despite the wind. "We have here Miss Khloe May, age 22, in good health and of substantial build." He paused, clearly struggling with the words. "The bidding will start at $100. Silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than any sound. Khloe stood on the platform, her cheeks burning with shame, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the spell of this nightmare. Finally, a voice called out from the back of the crowd. $50. It was Jake Morrison, the town drunk known for his inappropriate comments and wandering hands. The crowd erupted in nervous laughter, as if his pathetic bid had somehow made the entire spectacle acceptable. $100, Jake, Pete corrected firmly. The starting bid, is 100. Ain't worth that much. Morrison shot back to more laughter. Khloe closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound, trying to retreat into the quiet place in her mind where her mother's voice still whispered prayers and lullabies. But even there, she couldn't escape the reality of her situation. She was being sold, auctioned off like a piece of farm equipment or a bag of grain. Her worth measured in silver dollars, her future determined by whoever had the most coins to spare. "Do I hear 100?" Pete called again, his voice growing more strained by the moment. Another long silence. Then from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a hesitant voice. $100. Khloe opened her eyes to see Tom Bradley, a young rancher she'd known since childhood, his face red with embarrassment. He wasn't bidding out of desire or cruelty, he was bidding out of pity, trying to save her from whatever fate awaited. $100 from Mr. Bradley, Pete announced with visible relief. "Do I hear 120? 150, came another voice. This time it was Marcus Webb, the general store owner, a widower in his 50s, who'd lost his wife to consumption the previous winter. His bid was clinical practical. He needed someone to keep house and manage his books. The bidding continued in fits and starts, climbing slowly, 200, 225, 250. Each number felt like a nail in the coffin of Khloe's dignity. She was being appraised, evaluated, reduced to nothing more than her potential usefulness to men who saw her as a commodity to be purchased. At $300, the bidding stalled. Tom Bradley shook his head apologetically. He simply couldn't afford more. Marcus Webb looked uncertain, clearly, calculating whether she was worth the investment. The crowd grew restless, their initial amusement giving way to boredom. $300, Pete called out. "Do I hear 323.10? Anyone?" Blackwood stepped forward, his ledger still in hand. "I'm afraid this isn't going to be sufficient, Luther. The debt stands at over $600. If the bidding doesn't improve significantly, we'll have to explore alternative arrangements." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone knew what alternative arrangements meant. The railroad company would take the family's land, their home, everything they had ever owned. Luther would be left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his failures. "Please," Luther called out to the crowd, his voice breaking. "She's a good girl. Strong as an ox, gentle as a lamb. She can cook, clean, sew, whatever you need. She's worth more than 300, I swear it." The desperation in his voice was painful to hear. Khloe felt tears threatening to spill, but she forced them back. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here, not now, not like this. 320. Pete tried again, his own voice reflecting the hopelessness of the situation. The crowd stirred restlessly. Some began to drift away, their entertainment value exhausted. Others whispered among themselves, calculating and cruel. Khloe could feel her future slipping away, could see herself becoming another casualty of Silver Creek's endless appetite for human misery. That's when she heard a sound that seemed to emerge from the very bowels of the earth itself. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and measured, crunching through the snow, with the inexorable force of destiny. The crowd began to part, whispers of recognition and fear rippling through their ranks like wildfire. "Is that? Can't be. Haven't seen him in town for nigh on 2 years. Sweet Mary, Mother of God." Kent McKenna emerged from the crowd like something out of legend. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed every bit of 300 pounds, all of it muscle and bone, and barely contained fury. His black beard hung nearly to his chest, shot through with premature streaks of silver, and his dark eyes held the kind of depth that comes from staring too long into the abyss of human nature. He wore a massive bearskin coat that made him look even larger than he was, and his boots, handmade and reinforced with iron, left deep impressions in the snow with each step. This was a man who had wrestled grizzlies, and one who had survived 3 Montana winters completely alone in the wilderness, who had earned a reputation as both protector and destroyer, depending on which side of his moral code you found yourself. The crowd fell silent as McKenna approached the auction block. Even Blackwood's enforcers seemed to shrink in his presence, their hands moving unconsciously to their weapons, but not quite daring to draw them. This was a man who had killed his share of troublemakers, and everyone present knew it. McKenna's gaze swept across the crowd before settling on Khloe. For a moment, that seemed to last forever. Their eyes met across the gulf of circumstance and tragedy that had brought them to this moment. In his dark stare, Khloe saw something she hadn't expected. Not lust, not cruelty, not even pity, but recognition. As if he saw something in her that no one else had bothered to look for. "What's the current bid?" McKenna's voice was like distant thunder, low and rumbling and impossible to ignore. Pete Holloway cleared his throat nervously. $300, Mr. McKenna. Are you interested in bidding?" McKenna reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of silver coins. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence of the square. "What's the debt?" $625, Blackwood answered smoothly, though there was a note of uncertainty in his cultured voice. Plus fees and interest, naturally. Without a word, McKenna opened his pouch and began counting out silver dollars, stacking them on the edge of the auction platform with deliberate precision. The metallic clink of each coin echoed across the square like a funeral bell marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. 100, 200, 300. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the stack grew higher. This wasn't just bidding, this was something else entirely. Something that transcended the crude economics of the auction block and entered the realm of the mythical. 400, 500, 600. "Stop, Luther!" May suddenly cried out, his voice cracked and desperate. "You don't have to pay the full amount. The highest bidder wins. That's how auctions work." McKenna's hand paused over his coin pouch. Slowly, deliberately, he turned to face Luther, and the look in his eyes could have melted steel. "I ain't bidding, Luther. I'm buying. There's a difference." He turned back to his counting, adding the final $25 to complete the stack. Then, without ceremony, he scooped up the entire pile and handed it to Blackwood. $625, McKenna announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "The debt is paid in full." Blackwood counted the money with practiced efficiency, his expression unreadable. "Indeed it is, Mr. McKenna. The transaction is complete." He gestured toward Khloe with mock gallantry. "She's all yours?" The words hit Khloe like a physical blow. "She's all yours." As if she were a piece of property to be transferred from one owner to another. As if her thoughts, her feelings, her very humanity were irrelevant to the proceedings. McKenna climbed onto the platform with surprising grace for such a large man. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His presence seemed to fill the entire space, making everything else fade into insignificance. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Can you walk, miss?" The question caught her off guard. Not "come with me" or "you belong to me now," or any of the other commands she had expected. Simply, "Can you walk? Yes." She whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then let's go home." Home. The word struck her like lightning. Not to his place, not to his cabin, not to whatever fate awaited her in the mountains. Home. McKenna offered her his arm, not grabbing, not demanding, but offering. As if she still had choices, as if her consent still mattered. Numbly, she accepted the gesture, feeling the solid strength of his forearm beneath the thick fabric of his coat. Together they descended from the auction platform. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea whispers, and speculation following in their wake. Some of the comments were crude, others sympathetic, but all of them seemed to come from very far away, as if she were hearing them through a thick fog. As they reached the edge of the square, McKenna paused and turned back to face the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Anyone who has a problem with what happened here today can come find me up on Bear Mountain. You all know where I live." His gaze swept across the assembly, lingering on Blackwood and his enforcers. "But understand this, she's under my protection now. Anyone who troubles her troubles me, and I ain't nearly as forgiving as the good Lord." The threat hung in the air like morning mist, understood by everyone present. Kent McKenna's protection was legendary in these parts, as absolute as it was dangerous. Those who earned it found themselves safer than if they'd been blessed by angels. Those who violated it, well, their bodies were usually found come spring thaw, if they were found at all. Without another word, McKenna led Khloe away from the square, away from the whispers and stares, away from the worst moment of her life. Their footsteps crunched rhythmically in the snow as they walked through the narrow streets of Silver Creek, past shuttered windows and curious faces peering from doorways. Khloe's mind reeled with questions and fears. Who was this man who had appeared like some mythical figure to purchase her freedom or her bondage? What did he want from her? What would he expect in return for his unexpected intervention? She had heard stories about Kent McKenna, whispered tales that painted him as everything from a guardian angel to a brutal savage, depending on who was telling them. They reached the edge of town, where McKenna's horse waited, a massive black stallion that seemed perfectly suited to its equally imposing master. The animal snorted and pawed at the ground, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air. McKenna helped her mount behind him, with surprising gentleness, as if he understood that she was operating in a state of shock and needed to be handled with care. Once she was settled, he swung up into the saddle with fluid motion and urged the horse forward into the wilderness. As Silver Creek disappeared behind them, swallowed by snow and distance, Khloe found herself facing an uncertain future, with a man she didn't know heading toward a destination she had never seen. The only thing she knew for certain was that her old life was over, burned away like so much kindling in the fire of her father's desperation. The mountain man who had bought her rode in silence, his broad shoulders blocking most of the wind, as they climbed higher into the wilderness. Behind them, the town of Silver Creek grew smaller and smaller, until it vanished entirely, taking with it everything she had ever known. What lay ahead remained a mystery, but one thing was certain. Kent McKenna had not just bought her at that auction. He had changed the course of her entire existence, for better or worse. And as they rode deeper into the snow-covered wilderness, Khloe May began the most dangerous journey of her life, learning to trust the stranger, who now held her fate in his calloused, gentle hands. The first chapter of their unlikely story had ended with silver coins and public humiliation. But as the horse's hooves carried them toward the towering peaks of Bear Mountain, a new chapter was about to begin, one that would test everything they thought they knew about love sacrifice and the possibility of redemption in the most unlikely of places. The silence between them stretched like the endless miles of snow-covered wilderness they traversed. Kent's stallion moved with sure-footed confidence along trails that seemed invisible to Khloe's untrained eye, climbing steadily higher into the heart of the Rockies, where civilization was nothing but a distant memory and survival depended on strength, wit, and an intimate knowledge of nature's unforgiving ways. Khloe clung to Kent's broad back, her arms wrapped around his waist, more from necessity than choice. Through the thick bearskin coat, she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid warmth of his body cutting through the mountain cold like a living furnace. She had never been this close to a man before her father's drinking had driven away any potential suitors years ago, and her size had discouraged the rest. The intimacy of their position sent confusing signals through her already overwhelmed mind. Hours passed in this fashion, the only sounds the rhythmic crunch of hooves in snow and the whisper of wind through pine branches, heavy with winter's burden. The sun, what little of it filtered through the gray clouds, began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the mountainside, and bringing with it the promise of temperatures that could kill the unprepared. How much farther? Khloe finally asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. Not far now, Kent replied without turning. His voice carried easily despite the weather, as if he were accustomed to making himself heard over nature's symphony. You cold? It was such a simple question, asked with such genuine concern, that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. After the humiliation of the auction, after being treated like livestock and sold to the highest bidder, this small kindness felt like a miracle. A little, she admitted, though in truth she was chilled to the bone. Her thin shawl offered little protection against the mountain wind, and her simple dress, adequate for town life, was laughably insufficient for this hostile environment. Without a word, Kent reached back and pulled a thick woolen blanket from his saddlebags, wrapping it around her shoulders while never losing his grip on the reins. The blanket smelled of wood smoke and pine needles of leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel strangely safe despite her circumstances. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, a gesture she felt more than saw, and urged the horse onward. Something in that simple exchange, the offering of warmth, the quiet acceptance of gratitude, began to chip away at the wall of fears she had built around her heart since leaving Silver Creek. This man, this legendary figure who had purchased her like a piece of property, was showing her more consideration than anyone had in months. As they climbed higher, the landscape around them transformed into something otherworldly. Towering evergreens stretched toward a sky the color of old pewter, their branches so heavy with snow, they seemed to bow in reverence to the mountain itself. Rock formations jutted from the earth like the bones of ancient giants, worn smooth by millennia of wind and weather. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, a reminder of humanity's insignificance in the face of creation's raw power. "There," Kent said, suddenly his voice carrying a note of something that might have been relief. "Home." Khloe looked ahead and felt her breath catch in her throat. Nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, sat a log cabin that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. It was larger than she had expected, built with obvious skill and attention to detail. Smoke rose from a stone chimney carrying the promise of warmth and shelter. Nearby she could see a sturdy barn and what appeared to be a well-constructed chicken coop, signs of a man who lived deliberately and prepared for the harsh realities of mountain life. But it was the setting that truly took her breath away. The cabin sat on a small plateau that offered sweeping views of the valley below and the mountains beyond. Even in winter's grip, she could see the beauty of this place, the way the light played across the snow-covered peaks. The perfect silence that spoke of true solitude, the sense of being completely removed from the world's cruelties and complications. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Kent dismounted and helped her down, his large hands, gentle but firm, as they steadied her on the snow-packed ground. Up close, she could see details that had been hidden during their ride, the way his dark eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, when she spoke, the careful way he moved his massive frame to avoid making her feel crowded or threatened, the competent efficiency with which he began tending to his horse. "Stable's warm," he said, leading the stallion toward the barn. "Get yourself inside. Fire's been banked, but it'll catch quick enough." She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. This was it, the moment when her new life would truly begin. Whatever lay beyond that cabin door would determine her fate, and she had no way of knowing whether she was walking into sanctuary or nightmare. Kent seemed to sense her hesitation. He paused in his work with the horse and turned to face her fully for the first time since the auction. In the fading daylight, she could see his face clearly weathered and scarred from years of hard living, but not cruel. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify, a careful reserve that spoke of a man who had learned to guard his thoughts and feelings. "Miss May," he said quietly, "I want you to understand something. What happened back there in town that weren't about you, that was about men's greed and your father's weakness. And the way this world grinds up anything soft enough to break. But you're here now and you're safe. I ain't gonna hurt you, and I ain't gonna force nothing on you that you don't want to give. You got my word on that." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever this man was, whatever he had done to earn his fearsome reputation, he was speaking truth in this moment. Khloe felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Thank you," she said. "I don't know what I expected, but you expected the worst," Kent finished for her, not unkindly. "Can't say I blame you for that. World's got a way of teaching folks to expect the worst, especially folks who've been kicked around some." He turned back to his horse, efficiently removing saddle and bridle with movements that spoke of long practice. "Go on inside. Get warm. There's coffee on the stove and beans in the pot. Help yourself to whatever you need." Khloe made her way to the cabin door, her feet sinking into snow that came nearly to her knees. The door was heavy, made of thick planks bound with iron, but it swung open easily on well-oiled hinges. Warmth hit her like a physical force as she stepped inside, and she couldn't suppress a small gasp of relief. The interior of the cabin was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of the crude bachelor quarters she had imagined, she found herself in a space that was clean, organized, and surprisingly comfortable. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace where embers glowed like jewels in the gathering darkness. Handmade furniture, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, spoke of a man who valued both function and comfort. Oil lamps provided steady, warm light, and she could see that every surface was meticulously clean. But it was the small details that truly surprised her. A quilt draped over the back of one chair, its pattern intricate and beautiful. Wildflowers dried now, but carefully preserved, arranged in a glass jar on the table. A Bible sitting open beside the fireplace, its pages worn from frequent reading. These were not the possessions of the savage hermit the town's gossips had described, but of a man who appreciated beauty and sought comfort in simple things. She moved deeper into the room, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the promise of hot food. The kitchen area was equally impressive: shelves lined with preserved goods, a wood-burning stove that radiated heat, copper pots hanging from hooks with the kind of care that spoke of a man who took pride in his domestic arrangements. A pot of beans simmered on the stove, filling the air with rich, savory aromas that made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She realized she hadn't eaten since dawn, had been too nervous and frightened to take the breakfast her father had offered with shaking hands and bloodshot eyes. She ladled beans into a bowl she found in the cupboard, poured herself coffee from the pot that stayed warm on the back of the stove, and settled into one of the chairs near the fire. The food was simple but well-prepared, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that tasted of mountain meadows and summer sun. The coffee was strong and black, warming her from the inside out. As she ate, she found herself studying the cabin with growing curiosity. This was clearly the home of a man who lived deliberately, who had created order and beauty in the midst of wilderness. Books lined the shelves, not just practical volumes on farming and hunting, but works of literature and philosophy that suggested an educated mind. A chess set sat on a small table near the window, the pieces carved from dark and light wood with obvious skill. The front door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the massive figure of Kent McKenna. He stamped the snow from his boots and shrugged out of his heavy coat, hanging it on a peg near the door. Underneath, he wore a simple wool shirt and dark pants, clothing that emphasized rather than concealed his imposing size. "Horse is settled," he said, moving to the stove to pour himself coffee. "Storm's coming in. We'll likely be snowed in for a few days." The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. Snowed in. Alone with this man she barely knew, this stranger who had bought her at auction like a piece of livestock. The cabin that had seemed so welcoming moments before now felt like a prison. Kent must have seen something in her expression, because he set down his coffee cup and raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy, miss. I ain't making threats. Just stating facts. This is mountain country, and winter don't ask permission before it moves in. But you're safe here. Cabin's solid, we got plenty of food and firewood, and I got a spare room where you can have your privacy." A spare room. The relief was so intense it nearly made her dizzy. She had been imagining the worst, sharing his bed, being forced into intimacies. She wasn't ready for becoming nothing more than property to be used at his whim. But a spare room meant privacy, meant dignity, meant the possibility that this arrangement might be something other than the nightmare she had feared. That's very kind of you," she managed. Kent settled into the chair across from her, his massive frame making the sturdy furniture look delicate by comparison. In the lamplight, she could see his face more clearly, the network of scars that spoke of a hard life, the premature gray in his black hair, the lines around his eyes that could have come from squinting into mountain sun or from years of accumulated pain. "Tell me about yourself, Miss May," he said quietly. "What you like to do, what you're good at, what makes you happy. I know this ain't exactly a normal situation we find ourselves in, but I figure we ought to get to know each other some if we're going to be sharing space." The question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked what made her happy? When had anyone shown interest in her thoughts, her preferences, her inner life? For months, she had been nothing but a burden to her father, a mouth to feed when money was scarce, a reminder of responsibilities he couldn't handle. Before that, she had been the fat daughter who couldn't find a husband, the spinster who would never give him grandchildren, the disappointment who had failed at the one thing women were supposed to do. I'm not sure anyone's ever asked me that before," she said honestly. Something shifted in Kent's expression, a tightening around his eyes that might have been anger, though she sensed it wasn't directed at her. "Well, I'm asking now. Take your time. Think about it." She took a sip of coffee, using the moment to gather her thoughts. What did make her happy? It had been so long since she'd had the luxury of considering such a question. "I like to read," she said finally, "when I can get books. And I like to sew, making things beautiful, fixing what's broken. I used to help my mother with her garden before she got sick. I liked watching things grow, seeing how careful tending could make flowers bloom, even in poor soil." Kent nodded encouragingly. "What else?" "I like to cook when we have ingredients worth cooking. And I like music, though I'm not much good at making it. My mother used to sing hymns while she worked, and I always thought that was the most beautiful sound in the world." She paused, suddenly self-conscious. "I suppose none of that's very interesting." "Interesting enough," Kent said. "What about books? What kind do you like?" She gestured toward his bookshelf. "May I?" At his nod, she rose and moved to examine his collection. What she found there made her eyes widen with surprise and delight. Poetry by Wordsworth and Keats, novels by Dickens and Austen, philosophical works by Emerson and Thoreau. These were not the kind of books she would have expected to find in a mountain hermit's cabin. "You have Jane Austen," she said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "Pride and Prejudice," Kent confirmed. "Read it 3 times. Emma twice. Good stories about folks trying to figure out how to live decent lives in complicated times." She turned to stare at him, This massive man who looked like he could wrestle bears and apparently spent his evenings reading Jane Austen. The contradiction was so unexpected, it made her head spin. "You're surprised," he observed, not seeming offended. Yes, I suppose I am. The stories they tell about you in town. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, especially when folks want to believe them. Truth is, I spent 4 years at Harvard before I came out here. Got myself a fine education in literature and philosophy before I decided I preferred the company of mountains to the company of men. Harvard. This mountain man, this legendary figure who had terrified an entire town into silence, was Harvard educated. Khloe felt the last of her preconceptions crumbling like ancient walls. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you leave?" Kent was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with eyes that seemed to be seeing something far away and long ago. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Because I learned that educated men can be just as cruel as ignorant ones. Sometimes more so because they got fancy words to dress up their cruelties. I came out here looking for something honest, clean air, clean water, clean living. Found it too, mostly." He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Loneliness. Deep, abiding loneliness that spoke of years spent in solitude, of a man who had chosen isolation over the risk of further disappointment. "What about you?" he asked. "What brought you to that auction block today? I heard about your mother's passing." "I'm sorry for that, but there had to be more to it than just medical bills." Khloe returned to her chair, suddenly exhausted by the day's events and the emotional toll of this conversation. How could she explain her father's descent into alcohol and gambling? How could she describe the slow dissolution of their family's dignity, the accumulation of debts and desperate choices that had led to this moment? "My father wasn't always," she began, then stopped. Loyalty to Luther warred with honesty about what their life had become. "He used to be a good man. Before the war, before he lost his leg at Gettysburg, before my mother got sick. But the pain, physical and otherwise, it was too much for him. He started drinking to forget, then gambling to try to win back what the drinking cost us. The railroad company was happy to extend him credit when he was winning, and even happier to collect when his luck turned. And you were the payment." The stark words hit her like a physical blow. Yes, though he told himself he was saving us both. If I married someone with money, someone who could take care of me, then maybe we could both survive. He convinced himself it was kindness, not desperation. Kent leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense but not unkind. "What did you want, Miss May? If none of this had happened, if your father was still the man he used to be, if your mother was still alive, if you could have any life you chose, what would it look like?" It was another question no one had ever asked her, and it took her several moments to formulate an answer. What did she want? She had spent so many years focused on duty and survival that her own desires had become foreign concepts. "I wanted to matter," she said finally. "To be useful, to be needed for something other than what I could fetch at auction. I wanted to have a home where people were happy to see me come through the door, where my presence made things better instead of worse. I wanted to wake up in the morning excited about the day ahead instead of just hoping to survive it." "You wanted to be loved," Kent said quietly. "Yes," she whispered, the admission feeling like a confession. "I wanted to be loved. Not pitied, not tolerated, not accepted out of duty or obligation. Just loved for who I am not, despite it." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind around the cabin's eaves. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, visible through the windows as white specks dancing in the lamplight. The storm Kent had predicted was arriving, sealing them into this small world of warmth and tentative understanding. "I want to show you something," Kent said, suddenly rising from his chair with fluid grace. He moved to a chest in the corner of the room, opened it, and withdrew something wrapped in soft cloth. When he returned to the fire, he carefully unwrapped what appeared to be a photograph in an ornate silver frame. "This was my wife," he said, handing her the photograph. Khloe looked down at the image and felt her breath catch. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, but not in the conventional sense that magazines and society pages celebrated. She was full-figured with kind eyes and a gentle smile that radiated warmth even through the formal constraints of photography. She looked like the kind of woman who would bake bread for sick neighbors and know exactly what to say to a crying child. Her name was Rebecca. Kent continued, his voice soft with memory. "We met at Harvard. She was working in the library while her brother attended classes. Smartest woman I ever knew, could quote Shakespeare and Shelley from memory. But she was also practical as sunrise. Could doctor animals grow vegetables in poor soil? Make a house feel like home just by walking through the door?" "She's lovely," Khloe said honestly. She was. "We had 2 years together before the fever took her. Best 2 years of my life, and the reason I know what real love looks like." He paused, his gaze moving from the photograph to Khloe's face. "Real love don't care about size or shape or what other folks think is beautiful. Real love sees straight through to the soul and decides that's the place it wants to live." Khloe felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand something. What happened today, me buying you at that auction, it wasn't about owning you or having power over you. It was about seeing something in you that reminded me of her. The same dignity, the same strength that don't advertise itself but shows up when it's needed. The same capacity for kindness, even when the world ain't been kind back." He reached over and gently took the photograph from her hands, cradling it like something precious. "I ain't looking to replace Rebecca, can't nobody do that. But I've been alone up here for 3 years, and loneliness is a cold companion in winter. Maybe we can help each other, Miss May. Maybe we can build something together that honors both our losses and gives us both a reason to be grateful for tomorrow." The offer hung between them, like a bridge across a chasm, fragile, uncertain, but real. Khloe stared into the fire, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single day. This morning she had awakened in her father's house, facing the prospect of being sold like livestock. Now she sat in a warm cabin with a man who read Jane Austen and spoke of love with the reverence of someone who had found and lost the real thing. "What would you expect from me?" she asked carefully. "Honesty," Kent replied without hesitation. "Companionship when you feel like giving it, solitude when you need it. Help with the cooking and cleaning if you're willing, though I've been managing on my own well enough. Mostly I'd expect you to figure out who you want to be when nobody's telling you what that should look like. And if I can't, if I'm just not enough." Kent set the photograph aside and leaned forward, his dark eyes serious. "Miss May, let me tell you something about enough. I seen men who thought they were everything the world wanted. Handsome, rich, educated, smooth-talking, who turned out to be empty as a broken water barrel. And I seen folks who thought they weren't worth the powder to blow them up, who had more heart and courage than a cavalry regiment. You got something in you that made you stand up on that auction block with your head high, when other folks would have crumbled. That's enough for me. Question is it enough for you?" Outside, the wind picked up, sending snow spiraling past the windows in thick white curtains. The storm was settling in for the night, creating a cocoon of isolation around the cabin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to define what their relationship might become. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight, they had taken the first tentative steps toward understanding. "I'd like to try," Khloe said finally. I don't know what I have to offer or whether I can be what you're hoping for, but I'd like to try." Kent smiled, then the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. The harsh lines softened. The guarded expression gave way to something approaching warmth. And for a moment, she caught a glimpse of the man Rebecca had fallen in love with. "That's all anyone can do," he said. "Try and see what grows from the trying." He stood and moved to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. "Storm's getting worse. We'll be snowed in for at least 3 days, maybe more. Good thing I stocked up on supplies when I was last in town." He turned back to her with a slight grin. "Hope you like chess, Miss May. We're going to have plenty of time to get acquainted." As if summoned by his words, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows and sent snow cascading from the roof with a sound like distant thunder. The cabin creaked, but held steady, a testament to Kent's skill as a builder and his understanding of mountain weather. "I should show you to your room," he said, lifting an oil lamp from the table. "Let you get settled before the fire burns down." He led her through a doorway into a smaller room that had clearly been prepared for a guest. A bed with a thick mattress and warm quilts, a washstand with fresh water, a small dresser, and even a chair by the single window. It was simple but comfortable, and most importantly, it was private, a space where she could retreat and process the day's overwhelming events. "There's extra blankets in the chest if you need them," Kent said, setting the lamp on the dresser. "Chamber pot's under the bed, though. There's a proper outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin if you prefer. Just follow the rope I strung from the back door. Easy to get lost in a storm like this." "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I know this must be strange for you too." Kent paused in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the light from the main room. "Strange, yes, but not unwelcome. Been a long time since this place felt like anything more than just a place to sleep." After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Khloe sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of her new reality. This morning she had been Khloe May, the spinster daughter of a drunk destined for either a loveless marriage to whoever would have her, or a lifetime of caring for a father who resented her very existence. Tonight she was the companion of a mountain man, the guest of a lonely hermit, something else entirely. She rose and moved to the window, pressing her face against the cool glass. Outside, the world had disappeared entirely, swallowed by snow and darkness. She could barely make out the shapes of the trees closest to the cabin. Everything else lost in the white void of the storm. It was both terrifying and oddly comforting, as if the weather had drawn a curtain around this place, creating a separate world where different rules might apply. From the main room came the sounds of Kent banking the fire for the night, the scrape of wood on stone, the soft thud of his boots on the plank floor. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, the kind of sounds that spoke of home and routine and the simple comfort of not being alone. Khloe undressed and slipped into her nightgown, then knelt beside the bed as she had every night since childhood. But when she tried to pray, the familiar words wouldn't come. How did you thank God for being sold at auction? How did you make sense of a day that had begun in humiliation and ended in something that might be hope? Instead, she found herself thinking of her mother's last words whispered from a bed much smaller and less comfortable than this one. "Everything happens for a reason, Khloe. Even the hard things. Especially the hard things. Trust in that and trust in yourself." Maybe this was what her mother had meant. Maybe all the pain and loss and degradation had been leading to this moment, this place, this chance to become something more than she had ever imagined possible. It seemed too much to hope for, but then again this entire day had been built on impossibilities. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in silence and snow. But inside the cabin, warmth and possibility flickered like candlelight, fragile but real, casting new shadows on the walls of what had once seemed like an impossible future. Khloe woke to the sound of complete silence, the profound, muffled quiet that only comes with heavy snowfall. For a moment she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by the absence of her father's morning coughing fits and the usual sounds of Silver Creek stirring to life. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and with them the strange mixture of relief and uncertainty that had become her new reality. Pale morning light filtered through the frost-covered window, illuminating her breath in small puffs of vapor. The room was cold despite the thick quilts, testament to the brutal efficiency of mountain winter. From the main room came the sounds of someone moving about, the scrape of metal on stone, the crackle of kindling, catching fire, the soft thud of boots on wooden floors. She dressed quickly in the same gray dress she had worn to the auction, suddenly conscious of how shabby her single outfit must appear to a man who clearly valued order and quality in his surroundings. When she emerged from her room, she found Kent crouched before the fireplace, coaxing flames from the banked embers with practiced efficiency. He looked up at her approach, his dark eyes taking in her appearance, with neither judgment nor pity, simply acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, rising to his full, imposing height. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," she admitted truthfully. The bed had been comfortable, the room warm enough with the extra blankets, but more importantly, she had felt safe for the first time in months. No sound of her father stumbling home drunk, no worry about creditors pounding on the door, no fear of what the next day might bring. "Coffee's ready," Kent said, gesturing toward the kitchen area. "And I got biscuits in the oven. Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." The domestic normalcy of the scene struck her as almost surreal. Yesterday she had been auctioned off like livestock, and now she was being offered breakfast by a man who seemed more concerned with her comfort than asserting whatever rights his purchase might have granted him. She poured coffee into a tin cup, inhaling the rich aroma that spoke of beans far better than anything her father had been able to afford in recent months. The warmth spread through her hands and up her arms, driving away the last vestiges of sleep and mountain cold. "Snow's still coming down," Kent observed, pulling a pan of golden biscuits from the oven. "Looks like we'll be keeping each other company for at least another day or two." Through the window, Khloe could see that the world had been transformed overnight. What had been a landscape of familiar shapes, trees, rocks, the outline of the barn, was now an alien terrain of white curves and mysterious mounds. The snow was still falling steadily, not the violent blizzard of the previous evening, but a determined, persistent accumulation that spoke of winter's serious intentions. "I should earn my keep," she said, accepting a biscuit that was still warm from the oven. "Tell me what needs doing." Kent settled into his chair with his own coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. "You don't owe me work, Miss May. You don't owe me anything." "Everyone earns their keep," she replied firmly. "My mother taught me that. And please call me Khloe. After yesterday, formality seems a bit ridiculous." But something shifted in Kent's expression. Approval, perhaps, or recognition of a principle he shared. "Fair enough, Khloe. And I'm Kent, not Mr. McKenna or any such nonsense." He gestured around the cabin with one large hand. "As for work, well, there's always plenty to do in a place like this. Animals need tending meals, need cooking clothes, need mending. But first, let me show you around proper-like. If you're going to be living here, you ought to know how everything works." The casual way he said living here made her heart skip. Not staying temporarily, not visiting until other arrangements could be made, but living here, as if this might truly become her home, not just a way station between one uncertainty and another. Kent led her on a tour of the cabin, explaining the practical details of mountain life with the patience of a born teacher. The root cellar beneath the kitchen floor stocked with preserved vegetables and smoked meat. The water system he had engineered to bring fresh spring water directly into the kitchen sink. The clever arrangement of mirrors and oil lamps that maximize the available light during the dark months of winter. Built most of this myself, he said with quiet pride. Took 3 years to get it right, but I wanted something that would last. Something Rebecca would have been proud of. The mention of his deceased wife hung in the air between them, not uncomfortable but significant. Khloe understood that she was being allowed into a space that had been created as a shrine to love and loss, and the responsibility of that trust weighed heavily on her shoulders. She would have loved it, Khloe said honestly. It's beautiful. Practical, but beautiful. Kent's smile was brief but genuine. Come on, let me show you the barn. They bundled into heavy coats. Kent produced a spare for her that had clearly belonged to a woman, though he made no comment about its origins and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit Khloe like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. The snow was knee-deep and still falling, each flake sharp and crystalline in the mountain air. The barn was a masterpiece of frontier engineering built to withstand anything nature could throw at it. Inside, the air was noticeably warmer, heated by the body warmth of the animals and insulated by the thick log walls. Kent's stallion Goliath stood in a spacious stall munching hay with the contentment of a creature that knew itself well cared for. Nearby, a milk cow regarded them with placid curiosity, and chickens pecked and strutted in a separate enclosure that protected them from both weather and predators. Goliath there is spoiled rotten, Kent said, patting the massive horse's neck with obvious affection. Bessie gives enough milk for both of us, and the chickens keep us in eggs year-round. Not a bad life for any of us. Khloe watched him tend to the animals, with gentle efficiency, speaking to each in the low, soothing tones that marked a man comfortable in their company. It occurred to her that this was probably the longest conversation Kent had had with another human being in months. Yet he showed no signs of the social awkwardness she might have expected from a hermit. "You're not what I expected," she said as they made their way back to the cabin through the driving snow. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more savage, I suppose. The stories they tell about you in town." Kent chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. "Let me guess. That I eat raw meat and howl at the moon, that I've killed more men than smallpox. Something like that. Well, the men I've killed deserved it, and I prefer my meat cooked." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither boastful nor apologetic. "Folks in town need their bogeymen, Khloe. Makes them feel better about their own failings if they can point to someone who's supposedly worse." They shed their coats and boots in the entryway, and Khloe found herself grateful for the cabin's warmth after even that brief exposure to the mountain winter. As they settled back by the fire with fresh coffee, she decided to voice the question that had been nagging at her since the previous evening. "Why did you really buy me yesterday?" she asked. "And don't say it was just kindness. Nobody spends that much money on kindness." Kent was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames with eyes that seemed to be seeing something far away. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful honesty. "Because I recognized something in you that I hadn't seen in a long time. The way you stood up there on that platform, scared but not broken. Ashamed but not defeated. It reminded me of Rebecca when I first met her." He looked up at Khloe, then his gaze direct and unflinching. She'd been told her whole life that she wasn't pretty enough, smart enough, worth enough to matter. But she had this fire inside her, this refusal to let the world's cruelty make her cruel in return. You got that same fire. "I don't feel very fiery," Khloe admitted. "I feel more like ashes most days." "Ashes can be stirred back to flame if they're tended right." The words settled between them like a promise, fragile but real. Outside, the wind picked up again, sending snow cascading from the roof with sounds like distant applause. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the world by weather and distance, forced to define their relationship without the complications of outside expectations or interference. "Teach me to play chess," Khloe said suddenly. Kent raised an eyebrow. "Chess? You said we'd have time to get acquainted, and you have that beautiful set by the window. I've always wondered about it, but nobody ever offered to teach me." "Chess isn't exactly a ladylike pursuit," Kent observed, though his tone suggested amusement rather than disapproval. "Good thing I was never much of a lady." Kent's laugh was rich and genuine, transforming his entire face. "All right then. Chess it is. But I warn you, I don't believe in letting folks win just to be nice. You'll have to earn every victory." They moved to the small table by the window where the chess set sat like a work of art. The pieces were carved from contrasting woods, dark walnut and light maple, with a level of detail that spoke of hours of careful craftsmanship. "Did you make these?" Khloe asked, running her fingers over a knight's intricately carved mane. "Winter project a few years back. Gets lonely up here when the snow's deep and a man needs something to keep his hands busy." As Kent explained the rules and movements of each piece, Khloe found herself drawn into the game's elegant complexity. It was like a miniature war fought with ceremony and intelligence rather than brute force, a battle where strategy mattered more than strength, where careful planning could overcome seemingly impossible odds. "The queen is the most powerful piece," Kent explained, positioning the carved figure at the center of the board. "She can move any direction, any distance, limited only by the pieces in her path. But she's also vulnerable because she's so valuable. Lose your queen carelessly, and the game's as good as over." "Like life," Khloe observed. "Exactly like life." They played 3 games that first afternoon, and Kent soundly defeated her in each one. But Khloe was a quick learner, and by the 3rd game, she was beginning to see the patterns, to understand the way pieces worked together to control the board. More importantly, she was beginning to understand Kent himself, the way his mind worked, the careful deliberation he brought to every decision, the respect he showed for an opponent, even when victory was certain. "You're getting better," he said after capturing her king for the 3rd time. "Few more games and you'll be giving me real competition." "Few more games and I might actually enjoy losing," Khloe replied with a laugh that surprised them both. That evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing a simple dinner of venison stew and cornbread, Khloe felt something she hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged at exactly the right moment. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the cabin's walls, warmth and companionship created a sanctuary that felt almost sacred. "Tell me about Harvard," she said as they cleaned up after dinner. "What was it like?" Kent dried the dishes, she watched his movements, economical and practiced. Lots of young men convinced they knew everything about. Everything, mostly. Some good professors who actually did know a few things worth learning. I studied literature and philosophy, figured I'd become a teacher or maybe a writer. "What changed your mind?" "The war," Kent said simply. "Everything changed after the war." Khloe waited, sensing there was more to the story, but unwilling to push for details he might not be ready to share. Outside, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows, reminding them of the storm's continued presence. "I enlisted right after Fort Sumter," Kent continued after a moment. "Thought it would be glorious, thought. We'd whip the rebels in a few months and come home heroes. Took 4 years and more blood than you can imagine to learn how wrong I was." "Where did you serve?" "All over. Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor. Places where boys went to die and men learned what hell looks like." He set down the dish towel with hands that were perfectly steady, but Khloe could see the cost of those memories in his eyes. "When it was over, I tried to go back to Boston, back to my books and my comfortable life. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. Couldn't unknow what I'd learned about what men are capable of doing to each other. So you came west? So I came west. Found Rebecca built this place, tried to create something clean and simple after all that complexity and horror. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. That's why I can't abide cruelty, Khloe. Why what happened to you yesterday made me so angry. I've seen enough suffering to last 10 lifetimes. Don't have the stomach to watch it happen when I got the power to stop it. The next morning brought clearing skies and the kind of crystalline beauty that only follows a major storm. The world outside the cabin had been transformed into something magical. Every tree branch outlined in white, every surface sculpted by wind and snow, into curves and angles that defied natural logic. The sun, when it finally appeared through the breaking clouds, turned the entire landscape into a cathedral of light and shadow. Beautiful, isn't it? Kent said, joining Khloe at the window where she stood mesmerized by the view. I've never seen anything like it. It's like a fairy tale. Fairy tale with teeth, Kent observed. All that beauty could kill you in an hour if you weren't prepared for it. That's the thing about mountains. They don't care about your convenience or your schedule. They operate by their own rules, and you either learn to respect those rules or you don't survive. They spent the morning digging out from the storm, Kent wielding a shovel with the same easy competence he brought to everything else, while Khloe cleared snow from the chicken coop and barn doors. The work was hard but satisfying, and she found herself enjoying the burn in her muscles and the bite of cold air in her lungs. You're stronger than you look, Kent observed as they took a break for coffee and biscuits. Had to be. Ma was sick for over a year before she passed, and Pa wasn't much help toward the end. I did most of the heavy work around our place. Shows in how you carry yourself. Most folks from town move like they're afraid of breaking something. You move like you know your own strength. It was the first time anyone had ever suggested she might be strong, rather than simply large, and the compliment warmed her more than the hot coffee. Back in Silver Creek, her size had been a source of constant shame and comment. Here with Kent, it was simply a fact to be acknowledged and perhaps even appreciated. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. They were inside playing another game of chess when Goliath's whinny from the barn alerted them to someone's approach. Kent rose immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Stay inside, he told Khloe, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Through the window, she watched him wade through the deep snow toward the approaching figure. It was a man on horseback, hunched against the cold, and clearly struggling to make progress through the drifts. As he drew closer, Khloe recognized him, with a shock of surprise and concern. It was Dr. Samuel Morrison, Silver Creek's only physician, and one of the few men in town who had ever shown her genuine kindness. He was also, she realized with growing alarm, the only person who would brave the mountain trails in such weather, unless driven by desperate necessity. Kent and the doctor spoke for several minutes in the yard, their conversation too distant for her to overhear, but clearly serious in nature. Finally, Kent gestured toward the cabin, and both men began making their way through the snow toward the door. Doc Morrison, Kent announced as they entered, stamping snow from their boots. Says he's got urgent business to discuss. Dr. Morrison was a small, neat man in his 60s whose gentle demeanor disguised a backbone of steel forged in years of frontier medicine. His weathered face was grim as he accepted the coffee Ken offered, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of bad news. Miss May, he said, inclining his head respectfully. I'm glad to see you're well. I was concerned about you after yesterday's events. Thank you, Doctor. That's kind of you to say. Morrison took a sip of coffee, clearly gathering his thoughts. I'm afraid I'm not here for a social call. There's been trouble in town since you left. Serious trouble. Kent leaned forward in his chair, his expression alert. What kind of trouble? Harrison Blackwood and his railroad men. They're claiming the auction was illegal, that Luther didn't have the right to sell his daughter to settle his debts. They're saying the whole transaction was fraudulent and demanding that Miss May be returned to town for reevaluation. The words hit Khloe like a physical blow. After 2 days of peace a beginning to believe that her nightmare might truly be over, the specter of her past was reaching out to drag her back into humiliation and worse. On what grounds? Kent's voice was dangerously quiet. They claim Luther was too intoxicated to make legal decisions, that the debt was artificially inflated through illegal interest rates, and that selling a human being constitutes slavery, which has been illegal since the Emancipation Proclamation. Morrison paused, his expression troubled. Of course, those same arguments could have been made before the auction if they'd wanted to stop it. The fact that they're making them now suggests other motives. What kind of other motives? Khloe asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Morrison exchanged a meaningful look with Kent before answering. There's been talk about your mother's property, Miss May. Apparently Sarah's will left you sole heir to that spring on the back 40 of your family's land. The railroad's been trying to acquire water rights to that spring for years. It's the only reliable source for 50 miles in either direction. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place in Khloe's mind. The auction hadn't been about settling Luther's gambling debts. It had been about separating her from her inheritance. With her publicly humiliated and sold off to the highest bidder, the railroad could have easily pressured Luther into signing over the water rights for whatever pittance they chose to offer. But Kent's unexpected intervention had disrupted their plan, and now they were scrambling to find another way to achieve their goals. So they want her back in town where they can control the situation, Kent said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. That's my reading of it, Morrison confirmed. Judge Patterson's agreed to hold a hearing day after tomorrow to determine the legality of the auction and Miss May's current status. Blackwood's hired a lawyer from Denver, fancy fellow, with a reputation for getting railroad companies what they want. And if they win? Khloe asked, though she dreaded the answer. Then you'll be declared a ward of the court until your legal status can be determined, which likely means Blackwood gets temporary custody and your father gets pressured into signing over those water rights to pay for your care and upkeep. The elegant trap was becoming clear. Whether the auction was legal or not, Blackwood would find a way to control her fate and through her gain access to the one thing that could make the Continental Railroad's western expansion profitable. There's more, Morrison continued reluctantly. Luther's disappeared. Nobody's seen him since the morning after the auction. Some folks think he ran off with guilt. Others think Blackwood's people might have helped him disappear to prevent him from testifying on your behalf. Kent rose from his chair with fluid motion, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute determination. They can hold all the hearings they want. Khloe ain't going back to town unless she chooses to. And if Blackwood wants to try and take her by force, he's welcome to come up here and try. Kent, Morrison said carefully, they've got the law on their side now. Judge Patterson's issued a warrant for your arrest on charges of kidnapping and interference with legal proceedings. They've also got a dozen armed men ready to enforce that warrant. Let them come. The simple words carried more menace than any threat Khloe had ever heard. Kent turned from the window, and she saw something in his expression that reminded her why his reputation struck fear into the hearts of grown men. This was not the gentle chess teacher or the considerate host she had come to know. This was the man who had survived 4 years of war and 3 years of mountain solitude, who had carved his place in the world through strength and will and an absolute refusal to back down from a fight. There might be another way, Morrison said quickly. A legal way that doesn't involve bloodshed. I'm listening. Marriage. The word dropped into the cabin's warm air like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and possibility in all directions. Khloe felt her heart skip as the implications became clear. If Miss May were to marry voluntarily, Morrison continued, her legal status would be settled beyond any court's ability to challenge. A married woman's property rights transfer to her husband, which would put the water rights beyond Blackwood's reach. And the question of the auction's legality becomes moot. She would no longer be property to be bought or sold, but a free woman making her own choices. Kent turned to look at Khloe, his expression unreadable. It would have to be her choice. Completely her choice, with no pressure from me or anyone else. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Khloe felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Marriage to a man she had known for only 3 days. Marriage to escape the clutches of men who would use her as a pawn in their schemes. Marriage to someone who had shown her more kindness in 72 hours than she had received in the previous year. But also marriage to a man she barely knew, whose past contained shadows and mysteries she could only guess at. Marriage that would bind her fate to his in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Marriage that might be born of necessity, rather than love, convenience, rather than choice. How long do I have to decide? She asked. The hearing's day after tomorrow, Morrison said. But if you're going to do this, it needs to be done properly, with witnesses and legal documentation. I can perform the ceremony I'm ordained as well as being a doctor. But we'd need to get back to town to make it official. Back to town, Kent said grimly, where Blackwood's men are waiting. There's a way, Morrison said. The old mining road that comes down the backside of the mountain. It's blocked by snow now, but if we could get through it, we could reach the church without going through the main part of town. Get married quiet-like, file the papers with the county clerk, and present Blackwood with a fait accompli. Kent moved to a chest in the corner of the room and withdrew a detailed map of the local mountains, spreading it on the table where they had been playing chess. His finger traced routes and elevations with the expertise of a man who knew every trail and landmark within 50 miles. It's possible, he said finally. Dangerous, but possible. The road's narrow and steep, and one wrong step could send us tumbling into a ravine. But if we took it slow and careful... If we went, Khloe interrupted. If I decided to go through with this. Both men turned to look at her, and she saw in their faces the recognition that this decision was hers alone to make. No one could choose for her. No one could force her hand. For perhaps the first time in her life, she held complete control over her own destiny. I need some time to think, she said finally. This isn't a decision to be made lightly. Of course, Morrison said, rising from his chair. I'll stable my horse and stay the night, if that's all right with Kent. We can discuss the details in the morning, after you've had time to consider. After Morrison had been settled in the barn with blankets and hot coffee, Kent and Khloe found themselves alone by the fire once again. The chess game sat abandoned on the table, the carved pieces frozen in mid-battle like soldiers waiting for orders that might never come. What are you thinking? Kent asked quietly. I'm thinking that 3 days ago I was a spinster with no prospects and no future, Khloe replied. Now I'm being asked to marry a man I barely know to escape railroad barons who want to steal my inheritance. It's almost too much to believe. What does your heart tell you? It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the core of her dilemma. What did her heart tell her that Kent McKenna was unlike any man she had ever known? That in 3 short days he had shown her more respect and consideration than she had received in years. That the thought of returning to Silver Creek, of being dragged before Judge Patterson and auctioned off again to the highest bidder, filled her with a terror so profound it made her physically ill. But marriage was supposed to be about love, about finding someone who saw your soul and chose to spend their life with it. Could she marry for protection, for escape, for practical considerations that had nothing to do with romance? "My heart tells me that you're a good man," she said finally. "That you've been kind to me when you had no reason to be, that you've respected my dignity when others saw me as nothing more than property to be traded. But marriage is supposed to be about more than gratitude and convenience." Kent nodded slowly. "It is. Rebecca and I, we had something special. Something that doesn't come along very often." He paused, staring into the fire. "I can't promise you that kind of love, Khloe. I don't know if I'm capable of it anymore. But I can promise you respect and safety and a partnership based on honesty and mutual support. And if love never comes, then we'll have friendship and companionship and the satisfaction of building something worthwhile together. Some folks have marriages based on a lot less." Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper, and the only sound was the soft hiss of snow against the windows. The storm was ending, leaving behind a world transformed and renewed. Perhaps Khloe thought transformation was exactly what she needed, not just a change of circumstances, but a fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her possibilities. "If I said yes," she said carefully, "what would you expect from me as a wife? Honesty above all else. Partnership in running this place if you're willing. Companionship when you feel like giving it solitude when you need it. And patience while we both figure out what this relationship might become. And children." Kent was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of old pain. "Rebecca and I tried for 2 years. Never happened. Doctor in Boston said it might be me, might be her, might be the Lord's will. If children come, they'll be welcomed. If they don't, that's the Lord's will too." It was an honest answer, free of pressure or expectation, and it only reinforced Khloe's growing conviction that Kent McKenna was indeed the rarest of men, one who said what he meant and meant what he said. The fire burned lower as they talked, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls and creating an intimacy that felt both natural and profound. By the time they finally retired to their separate rooms, Khloe had made her decision. It wasn't based on desperation or convenience or even gratitude, though. All of those played a part. It was based on something far simpler and more fundamental: trust. She trusted Kent McKenna. Trusted his strength, his integrity, his capacity for kindness, even in the face of a world that seemed determined to reward cruelty. She trusted that whatever their marriage might become, it would be built on a foundation of mutual respect and honest dealing. And perhaps given time and patience, and the kind of tender care that could nurture even the most unlikely seeds, it might become something more. Perhaps love could grow in the most unexpected soil, watered by shared challenges and warmed by genuine affection. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the settling sounds of the cabin and the distant whisper of wind through the pines, Khloe May made peace with her choice. Tomorrow she would tell Dr. Morrison and Kent that she was ready to become Mrs. Kent McKenna. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Not because she was running from something, but because she was running toward it. The girl who had stood on that auction block in shame and terror was gone, transformed as completely as the snow-covered landscape outside her window. In her place was a woman who knew her own mind and was ready to fight for her own future, whatever that might hold. The morning brought clarity as sharp and brilliant as the sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. Khloe emerged from her room to find Kent already dressed and preparing for what they all knew would be a dangerous journey. Dr. Morrison sat at the table examining his medical bag with the methodical care of a man who had learned that preparation could mean the difference between life and death. "I've made my decision," Khloe announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to commit to. "I want to do this. I want to marry you, Kent, if you'll have me. Kent looked up from the map he had been studying, and something in his expression shifted relief perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the quiet satisfaction of a man who had hoped for exactly this outcome. "I'm honored, Khloe, and I promise you won't regret it." Dr. Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she had seen from him since his arrival. "Then we'd better get moving. The weather's clear now, but this is mountain country. That could change in a heartbeat." They spent the next hour in careful preparation. Kent loaded his saddlebags with supplies for the treacherous journey rope medical kit, emergency food, warm blankets, and enough ammunition to discourage any unwelcome encounters. He also strapped on a pair of revolvers that transformed him from frontier gentleman to something far more dangerous. "You expecting trouble?" Morrison asked, eyeing the weapons. "Always expect trouble, Doc. That way you're prepared when it finds you." Khloe changed into the warmest clothes she possessed. Her mother's old riding skirt and a thick woolen sweater that had seen better days but would provide essential protection against the mountain cold. Kent provided her with a heavy coat, gloves, and boots that were too large, but infinitely better than her thin town shoes. "This belonged to Rebecca," he said quietly as he helped her into the coat. "She'd wanted to keep you safe." The gesture touched her more deeply than any declaration of love could have. To be entrusted with something so precious, so laden with memory and meaning, spoke of a trust that went beyond mere practicality. They led the horses from the barn into the crystalline morning air. Kent had saddled Goliath and Dr. Morrison's mount while he prepared a smaller mare. Rebecca's horse, he explained, gentle-tempered and sure-footed on mountain trails. The animal's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and their hooves crunched through snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the early light. "The trail starts about a mile north of here," Kent explained as they mounted up. "It's an old mining road that hasn't been used in 5 years, maybe more. Narrow, steep, and dangerous as hell, even in good weather. But it'll get us down to the valley without going through town." They set out single file, Kent leading on Goliath, followed by Khloe on the mare, with Dr. Morrison bringing up the rear. The first mile was deceptively easy, following a well-worn path through level terrain that offered sweeping views of the valley below. Silver Creek looked peaceful from this distance, its buildings tiny and insignificant against the vastness of the Montana landscape. But Khloe knew that peace was an illusion. Somewhere down there, Harrison Blackwood and his men were plotting her capture and the theft of her inheritance. Judge Patterson was preparing for a hearing that would determine her fate based on legal technicalities and railroad gold. And her father, if he was still alive, was hiding from the consequences of his desperate choices. The old mining road, when they finally reached it, was barely recognizable as a path at all. Years of disuse had allowed nature to reclaim much of it, and the recent snowfall had obscured what remained. Only Kent's intimate knowledge of the mountain's geography allowed him to find the route at all. "From here on, we go slow and careful," he announced, dismounting to examine the trail ahead. "One mistake and we'll be collecting ourselves at the bottom of a ravine." The next 3 hours were a testament to the unforgiving nature of mountain travel. The path wound along the face of steep cliffs, sometimes so narrow that the horses' hooves sent loose stones tumbling into the abyss below. In places, snow had drifted so deep that they had to dismount and lead their animals through drifts that came up to their waists. Khloe had never been so cold or so frightened in her life. The altitude made her dizzy. The cold seeped through every layer of clothing to settle in her bones, and the constant awareness of the drop-off, mere inches from the trail's edge, kept her heart pounding with terror. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that retreat would mean surrender to forces that would destroy everything she had left. "How you holding up?" Kent called back during one of their brief rest stops. "Still breathing," she replied, surprised to find she could manage humor even in such circumstances. "That's the spirit. We're halfway there." The second half of the journey proved even more treacherous than the first. The trail descended sharply following a series of switchbacks that tested both human and animal endurance. Ice hidden beneath the snow made footing treacherous, and more than once, Khloe felt her mare slip and scramble for purchase on the slick stone. It was during one of these moments of crisis that disaster nearly struck. They were navigating a particularly narrow section of trail when Khloe's mare stepped on a loose stone hidden beneath the snow. The animal stumbled its front legs, going down. And for a terrifying moment, Khloe found herself sliding sideways toward the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as she fought for balance, her gloved hands clutching desperately at the mare's mane, while her feet searched for solid purchase in the stirrups. Below her, the mountainside dropped away into nothingness, a fall that would mean certain death. Then Kent was there, having somehow dismounted and reached her in the space of a heartbeat. His strong hands gripped her waist, pulling her back from the brink while simultaneously steadying her panicked horse. "Easy, easy," he murmured, though whether he was speaking to her or the mare was unclear. "You're all right. I've got you." For a moment they stood there on the narrow ledge, pressed close together by necessity, her face buried against his chest, while she fought to control her racing heart. She could feel the solid strength of him, the absolute steadiness that had saved her life, and something inside her shifted and settled like a key finding its proper lock. "Thank you," she whispered against his coat. "Any time," he replied, and she heard in his voice a depth of commitment that went far beyond the practical arrangement they had discussed. The remainder of the descent passed without major incident, though every step required constant vigilance and care. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. They emerged from the mountain trail at a point several miles east of Silver Creek, well away from the main roads and the prying eyes of Blackwood's men. The plan was to approach the town from the backside using a network of ranch roads and creek beds to reach the church without being seen. "From here, we need to be smart about it," Kent said, as they paused to rest and water the horses. "Blackwood's got men watching the main approaches, but he can't cover every cow path and deer trail in the county." They made their way carefully across the winter landscape, sticking to low ground and tree cover whenever possible. Dr. Morrison proved to be an invaluable guide, his decades of traveling to remote homesteads having given him an encyclopedic knowledge of every back road and hidden path in the region. As they drew closer to Silver Creek, signs of civilization began to appear. Fence lines, livestock shelters, smoke from distant chimneys. But they also began to see evidence of Blackwood's preparation for their expected arrival. Riders patrolled the main roads, and the doctor pointed out two men positioned on hilltops with field glasses scanning the approaches to town. "They're taking this seriously," Morrison observed. "So are we," Kent replied grimly. The church sat on the outskirts of Silver Creek, a simple wooden structure that had served the spiritual needs of the community for nearly 20 years. More importantly, for their purposes, it could be approached from the east through a grove of cottonwood trees that would provide cover almost to the building itself. They reached the edge of the grove just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful for such a momentous day. Through the trees, they could see the church's modest bell tower and the warm glow of lamplight in the windows. "Reverend Walsh is expecting us," Dr. Morrison said. "I sent word ahead through his wife's cousin. He'll have the papers ready and the ceremony planned." But as they prepared to make their final approach, Kent held up a hand for silence. Through the winter air came the sound of voices, multiple men talking in the low, urgent tones of conspirators planning mischief. They dismounted and crept forward through the trees until they could see the source of the voices. 6 men on horseback were positioned around the church, their weapons clearly visible and their intentions obvious. Blackwood had anticipated their strategy and positioned guards at every possible destination. "Damn," Kent muttered under his breath. "Should have known he'd think of this." "What do we do now?" Khloe asked, fighting down the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. They had come so far, risked so much, only to find their path blocked at the crucial moment. Kent studied the situation with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to tactical problems. "How many entrances does the church have, Doc?" "Front door, side door, and a back entrance through the vestry," Morrison replied. "But all of them are visible from where those men are positioned." "What about the bell tower? Any way to get up there from outside?" Morrison considered this. "There's a ladder on the back wall, but it's old and might not hold a man's weight." "It'll hold mine," Kent said with quiet confidence. "And from the bell tower, I can see exactly where each of those guards is positioned." "What are you thinking?" Kent's smile was predatory. "I'm thinking these railroad boys are about to learn why folks in these parts treat me with respect." The plan he outlined was simple, but dangerous. He would circle around to approach the church from the north, using the bell tower to gain a vantage point over the guards. Once he had assessed their positions and capabilities, he would create a distraction that would allow Khloe and Dr. Morrison to reach the church safely. "What kind of distraction?" Morrison asked nervously. "The kind that makes them all look in the same direction while you slip in the back door." Despite her fear, Khloe found herself impressed by Kent's tactical thinking. This was a man who had learned the art of warfare in the bloodiest conflict in American history, who understood how to turn superior numbers and position to his advantage. "How long do we wait?" she asked. Kent checked his pocket watch. "Give me 30 minutes to get into position. When you hear me start the festivities, count to 60 and then make your move. Once you're inside the church, you should be safe. These men might be willing to ambush travelers, but they won't start shooting up a house of God with witnesses around." He melted into the shadows with a silence that seemed impossible for such a large man. One moment he was there beside them, solid and reassuring, and the next he was gone as if he had never existed at all. The 30 minutes that followed were the longest of Khloe's life. She and Dr. Morrison crouched in the cold shadows of the cottonwood grove, listening to the guards' casual conversation and watching the church windows for signs of movement. Reverend Walsh was inside, she knew, waiting to perform the ceremony that would transform her from property to person, from victim to partner in her own destiny. The sound when it came was not what she had expected. Instead of gunshots or shouting, she heard the clear, resonant toll of the church bell once, twice, 3 times in the pattern that traditionally announced a wedding. The effect on the guards was immediate and dramatic. All 6 men turned toward the bell tower, their voices raised in confusion and alarm. 2 of them spurred their horses toward the back of the church, while the others maintained their positions, but focused their attention upward. "Now," Morrison whispered. They moved as quickly as silence would allow, leading their horses through the shadows toward the church's back entrance. The vestry door was unlocked as promised, and they slipped inside just as shouts erupted from the area around the bell tower. The interior of the church was warm and welcoming after hours in the mountain cold. Candles flickered on the altar, casting dancing shadows on the simple wooden walls. Reverend Walsh stood waiting in his formal robes, his weathered face calm, despite the commotion outside. "Miss May, Dr. Morrison," he said quietly. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't make it." "So were we," Morrison replied. "Is everything ready?" "Everything except the groom," Walsh observed with a slight smile. As if summoned by his words, Kent appeared at the front of the church, having somehow made his way down from the bell tower and through the building without being seen. His face was flushed with cold and exertion, but his eyes held a satisfaction that spoke of a job well done. "Those boys are going to be chasing shadows for the next hour," he announced. "Plenty of time for us to conclude our business." Reverend Walsh wasted no time in formalities. He had performed enough frontier weddings to know that circumstances didn't always allow for lengthy ceremonies or elaborate preparations. But what the service lacked in pomp, it made up for in sincerity and meaning. "Dearly beloved," He began, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words took on new significance in the flickering candlelight, with the sound of confused searchers still audible outside the church walls. This was not the wedding Khloe had dreamed of as a young girl. No white dress, no flowers, no congregation of family and friends. But it was real. And it was hers, and that was enough. When Walsh asked if anyone objected to the union, the only response was the distant sound of hoofbeats as Blackwood's men continued their fruitless search. When he asked Kent if he would take Khloe as his lawfully wedded wife, the big man's "I will" rang through the church with the solemnity of a sacred vow. And when he asked Khloe the same question, she looked into Kent's dark eyes and saw not just safety and protection, but the possibility of something she had never dared hope for: a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine caring. "I will," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The ring Kent placed on her finger was simple gold worn smooth by years of wear. "It was Rebecca's," he said quietly. "She would have wanted you to have it." Dr. Morrison served as witness, signing the marriage certificate with a flourish that spoke of satisfaction at seeing justice done. Reverend Walsh completed the legal documentation with practiced efficiency, ensuring that the union would be recognized by any court in the territory. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana," Walsh pronounced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. McKenna, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, respectful, and surprisingly warm, a promise of partnership rather than a claim of possession. When it ended, Khloe found herself looking into the face of her husband with a mixture of gratitude, hope, and something that might in time become love. "Mrs. McKenna," Kent said, testing the sound of her new name. "Mrs. McKenna," she agreed and discovered that she liked the way it sounded. The celebration was brief but heartfelt. Morrison produced a bottle of whiskey from his medical bag, and they toasted the union with tin cups borrowed from the church kitchen. Reverend Walsh offered his blessing and his promise that word of the marriage would reach the county clerk's office before morning. But their moment of triumph was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, many horses moving with purpose and determination toward the church. "Sounds like our friends have regrouped." Kent observed, his hand moving instinctively to his weapons. Through the church windows they could see riders surrounding the building, at least a dozen men heavily armed and clearly intent on enforcing Blackwood's will, regardless of legal niceties. "This is Harrison Blackwood," came a cultured voice from outside. "I have a legal warrant for the arrest of Kent McKenna and the return of Khloe May to town for a competency hearing. Come out peacefully and no one will be hurt." Kent's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Competency hearing? That's rich coming from a man who makes his living stealing water rights from widows and orphans." He moved to the window and peered out at the assembled force. 12 men, well armed, positioned to cover all the exits. They're serious about this. "What do we do?" Khloe asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We do what we came here to do," Kent replied. "We make sure everyone knows you're now a married woman with all the legal protections that entails." He opened the front door of the church and stepped out onto the small porch, his imposing figure clearly visible in the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice carried across the churchyard with the authority of a man who had never backed down from a fight. "Blackwood, you're trespassing on church property with armed men. I suggest you reconsider your position." Blackwood urged his horse forward, his face a mask of cultured rage. "I have legal authority here, McKenna. Stand aside and let me collect Miss May for her court appearance." "Mrs. McKenna," Kent corrected with obvious satisfaction. "As of 10 minutes ago, she's my wife, legally married before God, and witnesses with all the proper documentation." The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. His carefully laid plans, his legal maneuvering, his expensive lawyer from Denver, all of it rendered meaningless by a simple ceremony performed in a frontier church. "Impossible," he sputtered. "The wedding can't be legal. She's mentally incompetent, unable to consent to marriage." Dr. Morrison stepped onto the porch beside Kent, his medical bag clearly visible. "As the attending physician, I can testify that Mrs. McKenna is of sound mind and fully capable of making her own decisions. Any court in the territory will accept my professional opinion on the matter." Reverend Walsh joined them, holding the signed marriage certificate like a shield against injustice. "The union has been properly performed and witnessed. The documentation will be filed with the county clerk first thing in the morning." Blackwood's face contorted with rage as he realized the magnitude of his defeat. All his scheming, all his careful preparation had been undone by a simple act of legal marriage. The water rights he coveted were now beyond his reach, protected by laws that even his influence couldn't override. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll find another way." "No," Kent said quietly, but with absolute finality. "You won't. Because if you or any of your men come near my wife again, if you so much as speak her name in anger, I'll consider it a personal insult. And folks in these parts know how I handle personal insults." The threat was delivered without bluster or theatrics, but its impact was undeniable. Several of Blackwood's men shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly having heard stories about Kent McKenna's reputation for dealing with troublemakers. Blackwood himself seemed to deflate slightly, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his rage. He had overplayed his hand, alienated the local population with his heavy-handed tactics, and now faced the prospect of explaining his failure to railroad executives who didn't tolerate incompetence. "You'll regret this, McKenna," he said finally. "All of you will regret this." "The only thing I regret," Kent replied, "is not shooting you when you first rode into our valley with your schemes and your threats." Blackwood wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward town, his men following in disorganized retreat. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that seemed almost sacred in its completeness. "Well," Dr. Morrison said with obvious satisfaction, "that went better than expected." "Shaim," Kent turned to Khloe, to his wife, and she saw in his expression a mixture of relief, pride, and something deeper that she couldn't quite identify. "How do you feel, Mrs. McKenna?" "Free," she said without hesitation. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." As they prepared to return to the mountain cabin that was now truly her home, Khloe reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment. 3 days ago, she had been sold at auction like livestock, her future determined by the highest bidder. Now, she was a married woman with legal rights and protections, a partner in building something meaningful and lasting. The transformation seemed almost too dramatic to believe. But the gold ring on her finger was real. The marriage certificate in Reverend Walsh's hands was real. And the man beside her, her husband, was more real than anything she had ever known. The ride back to Bear Mountain was easier than the descent had been, partly because they knew the trail now, and partly because the weight of uncertainty had been lifted from their shoulders. They were no longer fugitives running from an unjust law, but a legally married couple returning to their home. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the lights of Silver Creek far behind, Khloe found herself thinking about the future with something approaching excitement. There would be challenges ahead, learning to live as partners, building a true marriage from the foundation of mutual respect they had established, creating a life together in the wilderness they both loved. But for the first time in years, those challenges seemed like opportunities rather than obstacles. She had found her strength, discovered her worth, and chosen her own destiny. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would face it as Mrs. Kent McKenna, a woman who belonged to no one but herself, who had learned that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, and who understood that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloomed in the aftermath of the harshest storms. The mountain cabin welcomed them home with the warm glow of banked embers and the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. As they stepped across the threshold, Khloe realized that everything had changed and nothing had changed in the span of a single day. The furniture was the same. The books still lined the shelves, the chess set waited patiently on its table by the window. But she was no longer a guest seeking shelter. She was Mrs. Kent McKenna, mistress of this mountain sanctuary partner in whatever life they would build together. Kent moved with quiet efficiency to revive the fire, while Khloe stood in the center of the room, suddenly uncertain about the practical realities of their new arrangement. They were married now, legally and spiritually bound. But what did that mean in the intimate confines of a two-room cabin? What were the expectations, the boundaries, the unspoken rules that would govern their daily existence? "You're thinking too hard," Kent observed, glancing up from the fireplace where flames were beginning to catch and dance. "I can practically hear the gears turning in your head." "I'm just trying to figure out how this works," she admitted. "I've never been married before. I don't know what you expect, what I should do, how to be a wife." Kent rose and dusted off his hands, his expression thoughtful. "How about we start with some coffee and figure it out as we go? Nobody's born knowing how to be married, Khloe. It's something people learn together, one day at a time." The simple wisdom of his words eased some of her tension. As she prepared coffee and sliced bread for a late supper, the familiar routines of domestic life provided a sense of normalcy that helped ground her in the new reality. They were Kent and Khloe, husband and wife now, but still the same people who had played chess and shared stories by this very fire. "Dr. Morrison will be spreading word of the marriage by now," Kent said as they settled into their chairs with steaming cups. "By tomorrow morning, everyone in Silver Creek will know that Khloe May is gone and Mrs. Kent McKenna has taken her place. And Blackwood will have to find another way to get his hands on those water rights. Maybe he'll try to buy them legitimately. Maybe he'll move on to easier prey. Either way, he can't touch you now." Khloe sipped her coffee and stared into the fire, thinking about the property her mother had left her, 40 acres of scrubland, with a spring that never ran dry. She had never seen it, had barely given it a thought when the lawyer read her mother's will. Now, it had become the key to her freedom. The thing that had prompted Blackwood's elaborate scheme and ultimately led her to this mountain sanctuary. "I should see it," she said suddenly. "The spring, I mean. It's mine now, ours, and I don't even know what it looks like." "Come spring, we'll ride down there," Kent promised. "See what your mother left, you decide what to do with it. Might be we could build something there, a summer place maybe. Or we could sell the water rights to the town for a fair price, help folks without lining Blackwood's pockets." The idea of having choices, of being able to make decisions about her own property, still felt foreign and wonderful. For so long, she had been powerless, dependent on others for even the most basic necessities. Now, she was not just a landowner, but a partner in a marriage, someone whose opinions mattered and whose voice would be heard. "What was it like, Shah?" she asked. "Your first marriage, I mean, with Rebecca." Kent was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant with memory. "Different," he said finally. "We were younger, full of dreams about what life would bring us. Everything felt possible then, like we could build whatever kind of future we wanted just by wanting it hard enough." "Do you miss that, the feeling that anything was possible?" "Sometimes. But I've learned that peace is worth more than possibility. Contentment matters more than dreams." He looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "Rebecca and I had passion, the kind of love that burns bright and hot. What we're building is different, steadier, maybe deeper in some ways. Built on choice rather than chance, on understanding rather than infatuation." Khloe felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the coffee. "You think we're building something?" "I know we are. Been building it since the moment you stepped off that auction block with your head held high. Question is, what kind of something do you want it to be? It was such a Kent question. Direct, honest, inviting her to examine her own heart and speak her truth. She set down her coffee cup and really considered the answer, thinking about the man who had rescued her from humiliation, who had offered her safety without demanding payment, who had married her to protect her rights while promising to respect her autonomy. "I want it to be real," she said finally. "Not just convenient or practical, but real. I want us to matter to each other, to build something that honors both Rebecca's memory and whatever future we might have." "That's a good want," Kent said quietly. "A worthy want." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly between them, while snow began to fall again outside the windows. It was not the violent storm that had marked their first days together, but the gentle, persistent snowfall that spoke of winter settling in for a long stay. "I should check on the animals," Kent said, eventually rising from his chair. "I'll come with you." The offer seemed to surprise him. "You don't need to. It's cold out there and the work's not particularly pleasant." "I'm your wife now," Khloe said, pulling on her heavy coat. "Your burdens are my burdens, your work is my work. Besides, I need to learn how things are done around here if I'm going to pull my weight." The barn was warm and filled with the comfortable sounds of animals settling in for the night. Goliath nickered a greeting, extending his massive head for the handful of oats Kent offered. Bessie the cow lowed contentedly from her stall, and the chickens rustled sleepily in their roost. "They're beautiful," Khloe said, watching Kent move among the animals with easy familiarity. "I've never been around livestock much. We never had the money for more than a few chickens back home." "They're good company," Kent replied, scratching Goliath behind the ears. "Don't judge, you don't lie till you don't want anything from you but food and water and a bit of kindness. Sometimes I think they're better companions than most people." As they worked together, Kent showing her how to check the water troughs, how to distribute hay, how to secure the barn against predators, Khloe felt a sense of rightness settling over her like a warm blanket. This was honest work, necessary work, the kind of labor that produced tangible results and genuine satisfaction. "You're a natural," Kent observed as she successfully coaxed one of the more skittish chickens back to its roost. "Most town folks are afraid of farm animals, but you move around them like you've been doing it all your life." "Maybe I have been in a way. Taking care of Ma when she was sick, managing the house. When Pa was too drunk to function. It's all about reading what something needs and providing it, isn't it?" Kent paused in his work, a forkful of hay halfway to Bessie's manger, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "That's exactly what it is. And it's exactly what makes a good partner, too." Back in the cabin, they went through the awkward ritual of preparing for their first night as a married couple. Kent banked the fire while Khloe tidied the kitchen, both of them moving carefully around the unspoken question of sleeping arrangements. Finally, Kent cleared his throat. "About tonight," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I want you to know that nothing has to change just because we're married now. You can keep your room, keep your privacy for as long as you want it. We'll take things at whatever pace feels right to you." The relief she felt was overwhelming, but so was something else, a small, unexpected pang of disappointment. Not because she was ready for intimacy, but because his careful distance reminded her of all the reasons why someone might not want to share a bed with her. Her size, her inexperience, her complete lack of the feminine graces that men supposedly valued. "Thank you," she said, hoping her voice didn't betray the complexity of her emotions. "That's very considerate." "It's not about consideration," Kent said gently. "It's about respect. What we have is good, Khloe. Real and solid and worth protecting. I won't risk damaging it by pushing for more than you're ready to give." Later, alone in her room though she was beginning to think of it differently now, Khloe lay awake listening to the settling sounds of the cabin and the soft murmur of wind through the pines. Through the thin wall that separated her from Kent's room, she could hear him moving about the creak of floorboards under his weight, the rustle of clothing being removed and folded. For the first time since agreeing to marry him, she allowed herself to truly think about the physical realities of their union. Kent was her husband now, with all the rights and expectations that entailed. Eventually, if their marriage was to be more than a legal convenience, there would have to be intimacy between them. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. She had never been kissed before their wedding ceremony, had never been held by a man, or touched with anything approaching desire. Her size had made her invisible to potential suitors, and her father's drinking had driven away the few who might have seen past her appearance to the woman beneath. But Kent had seen her, had chosen her, had married her, despite having no obligation to do so. What did that mean? What did he see when he looked at her? And what would happen when the careful politeness of their early marriage gave way to the deeper intimacies that true partnership required? The questions followed her into restless sleep, where dreams of snow and fire and strong, gentle hands chased away the nightmares that had plagued her for months. She woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing, the domestic aromas that spoke of home and security. Kent was already up and moving around the kitchen, his movements efficient and practiced as he prepared breakfast for two. "Good morning, Mrs. McKenna," he said when she emerged from her room, and something in the way he said her new name made her heart skip. "Good morning, husband," she replied, testing the word on her tongue and finding she liked the sound of it. They ate breakfast together as snow continued to fall outside, planning the day's activities with the easy cooperation of people learning to live in harmony. There was firewood to be split, bread to be baked, mending to be done. Simple, necessary tasks that would fill the hours and strengthen the bonds between them. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Kent said as he prepared to head outside. "About earning your keep. Truth is, I could use a partner in more than just name. This place requires a lot of work, and some of it's better suited to smaller hands and a gentler touch." "What did you have in mind?" "Cooking for one thing. I can manage basic meals, but I'm no hand at baking or preserving. And the chickens like you, I saw how they responded to you last night. Animals know when someone has a natural way with them." The idea of having real responsibilities, of being needed for something more than her inheritance, filled Khloe with excitement. "I'd like that. I'd like to feel useful." "You are useful. More than useful, you're necessary. This place was just a shelter before you came. Now it's starting to feel like a home." The weeks that followed established the rhythm of their married life. They worked together during the day, sharing tasks and responsibilities with the easy cooperation of people who understood each other's strengths. Kent taught her to split kindling and tend the animals, while Khloe brought her domestic skills to bear on cooking and preserving, and the 100 small tasks that made a house into a home. In the evenings, they read together, by the fire played chess, and talked about everything from philosophy to practical matters like crop rotation and animal husbandry. Kent proved to be not just educated but wise, with insights born of hard experience and careful observation. Khloe found herself opening up in ways she never had before, sharing thoughts and dreams she had never dared voice. "I used to think I was broken," she admitted one evening as they sat before the fire, she with her mending and he with a book of poetry. Too big, too awkward, too different to ever really belong anywhere. "What do you think now?" "Now I think maybe I was just in the wrong place. Like a mountain flower trying to bloom in desert soil." Kent looked up from his book, his dark eyes warm with understanding. "Rebecca used to say that God doesn't make mistakes, only mysteries. Maybe some of us just take longer to figure out what we're for." The casual way he spoke of Rebecca no longer caused Khloe pain. Instead, she found herself grateful for the woman whose love had taught Kent how to be gentle, how to see worth in unexpected places, how to build something beautiful from the materials at hand. Rebecca's memory was not a rival, but a teacher showing Khloe what their marriage could become, if tended with care and patience. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher around the cabin, they settled into a routine that felt increasingly natural and right. Khloe found herself anticipating Kent's return from his outdoor work, looking forward to their evening conversations, taking pleasure in the small ways she could make his life more comfortable. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the careful distance between them began to shrink. A brush of hands as he helped her with her coat. A moment of shared laughter that left them standing closer than strictly necessary. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching his expression soft with something that might have been affection. It was during one of these moments, a quiet evening, when they sat reading companionably by the fire, that Khloe made a decision that surprised them both. "Kent," she said, setting down her book, "I don't want to sleep in the spare room anymore." He looked up from his own reading, his expression careful and unreadable. "What do you want?" "I want to be your wife. Really your wife in every way that matters." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I know I'm not what most men would choose. I know I'm not beautiful or graceful or any of the things that wives are supposed to be. But I'm here, and I'm yours, and I want to build something real with you." Kent set aside his book and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his large, calloused ones. "Khloe, you listen to me. You are beautiful, not the kind of beauty that magazines and fashion plates celebrate, but the kind that matters. The beauty of a generous heart, a strong spirit, a mind that thinks for itself. You are exactly what I would choose, exactly what I need. You don't have to say that to make me feel better. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true." He reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch gentle but sure. "I've been waiting for you to be ready. But I've been ready since the day I saw you stand up on that auction block and refuse to be broken by what they were doing to you." When he kissed her this time, it was different from their wedding kiss, deeper, more urgent, full of the promise of intimacy to come. Khloe felt something inside her unfurl like a flower, touched by sun, a warmth that spread through her entire being, and made her understand for the first time what it meant to be desired. "Are you sure?" Kent asked against her lips. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back. We'll truly be married in every sense of the word." "I'm sure," she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He lifted her, then carrying her to his room. Their room now with a tenderness that took her breath away. In the soft light of the oil lamp, he showed her what it meant to be loved, not despite her flaws, but because of her wholeness, not as an object of pity, but as a woman worthy of desire and devotion. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Khloe marveled at the transformation that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a spinster facing a future of servitude and despair. Now she was a wife, a partner, a woman who had found her place in the world, and the man who valued her for exactly who she was. "No regrets?" Kent asked softly, his arm tightening around her. "Only one," she replied, surprising him. "What's that?" "I regret that it took so long for me to find you. All those years of believing I was worth nothing, when I could have been here building this life, being loved by you." "Everything happens in its own time," Kent said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We found each other when we were ready, when we could appreciate what we have. That's what matters." Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that seemed to mirror the changes in Khloe's own life. The snow melted, to reveal a landscape of impossible beauty, wildflowers carpeting the meadow's streams, running clear and cold, the air itself seeming to sparkle with possibility. They made their promised journey to see the spring that had indirectly brought them together, riding down familiar trails that looked entirely different, dressed in their spring finery. The property that Sarah May had left her daughter proved to be more valuable than anyone had imagined, not just for the water rights, but for the breathtaking beauty of the setting itself. "It's perfect," Khloe breathed, sitting beside the crystal-clear pool that bubbled up from deep within the earth. "No wonder Blackwood wanted it so badly." "What do you want to do with it?" Kent asked. Khloe considered the question, thinking about the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. "I want to share it. Build a way for the water to reach the town, help the people who helped us when it mattered. But on our terms for a fair price, with nobody getting rich off of other people's need." "That sounds like something your mother would approve of." "I hope so. I hope she can see what became of the life she saved." They returned to Silver Creek that day, for the first time since their wedding, riding openly down the main street with their heads held high. The town's reaction was everything Khloe could have hoped for: respect where there had once been pity, acknowledgement where there had once been dismissal, recognition of her worth as a person rather than judgment based on her appearance. Dr. Morrison greeted them with obvious pleasure, inquiring about their health and happiness with the satisfaction of a man who had played a crucial role in bringing about a happy ending. Reverend Walsh expressed his joy at seeing the fruits of the union he had blessed, noting that few couples began their marriages under such dramatic circumstances, yet seemed so perfectly suited to each other. Even the townspeople who had watched her humiliation at the auction now treated her with the courtesy due to Mrs. Kent McKenna, respected wife of a respected man. The transformation was almost too dramatic to believe, but it was real, and it was hers. As for Harrison Blackwood, he had departed Silver Creek shortly after their wedding, recalled to Denver by railroad executives who were less than pleased with his failures. The Continental Railroad eventually negotiated a fair contract for water rights, with Kent and Khloe paying a reasonable price for access that would benefit both the company and the local community. Luther May never returned to Silver Creek. Some said he had died of exposure in the mountains, others that he had found work in mining camps farther west. Khloe chose to believe that he had found some measure of peace, that the guilt over what he had done to his daughter had eventually led him to the kind of redemption that was still possible for those willing to seek it. The summer brought visitors to the mountain cabin. Dr. Morrison checking on their health, Reverend Walsh blessing their first anniversary neighbors, seeking Kent's help with various problems that required his particular skills. Each visit reinforced the reality of their place in the community, their acceptance as a couple who had earned their happiness through courage and choice. But the most meaningful moments came in the quiet times when it was just the two of them, working together in their garden, reading by the fire, planning for the future they would build together. They talked of children who might come, of improvements to the cabin and the land, of the ways they could continue to serve their community while maintaining the sanctuary they had created. "Do you ever miss it?" Khloe asked one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "The life you had before, when you could be alone with your books and your thoughts?" "Never," Kent replied without hesitation. "I thought I wanted solitude, but what I really wanted was peace, and I found that with you. Not the peace of emptiness, but the peace of completeness." As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Khloe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of contentment. The woman who had stood on that auction block in shame and terror seemed like a stranger now, someone she had once known but could barely remember being. In her place was Mrs. Kent McKenna, a woman who knew her own worth and had found someone who valued it. A woman who had learned that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, that courage could transform, the most desperate circumstances, and that sometimes the most broken hearts could heal into something stronger and more beautiful than they had ever been before. On the first anniversary of the day, Kent had bought her freedom. They returned to Silver Creek, not as fugitives or strangers, but as respected members of the community coming to visit friends. The town square where her nightmare had begun was now simply a place of commerce and ordinary life, holding no more terror for her than any other gathering place. As they stood together, where the auction block had once been, Khloe felt the final chains of her past fall away. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to do with the life that followed. She was no longer the fat girl who had been bought like cattle, but the woman who had found the courage to love and be loved in return. "Thank you," she said to Kent, her voice thick with emotion. "For what? For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For believing I was worth saving when I had given up believing it. For showing me that even the most broken things can be made whole again." Kent pulled her into his arms there in the town square, kissing her with a passion that spoke of enduring love rather than desperate gratitude. When they broke apart, they were surrounded by the warm smiles of townspeople who had witnessed their transformation from tragedy to triumph. "Come on, Mrs. McKenna," Kent said, taking her hand. "Let's go home." And as they rode back up into the mountains that had sheltered their love and witnessed their growth, Khloe knew that she truly was going home. Not just to a place, but to a life she had chosen, to a love she had earned, to a future that belonged entirely to her. The woman who had once believed herself worthless had discovered her true value. The girl who had stood alone on an auction block had found her place in the world. And the heart that had once seemed too broken to mend had healed into something strong enough to hold a lifetime of happiness. In the end, that was the greatest transformation of all.